May the Spirit of God be upon me as I share the good news of the gospel with you this morning. Just then, a lawyer stood up to test Jesus. "Teacher," he said, "what must I do to inherit eternal life?" He said to him, "What is written in the law? What do you read there?" He answered, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your mind, and with all your strength, and your neighbor as yourself." And Jesus said to him, "You have given the right answer. Do this, and you will live." But wanting to justify himself, the lawyer asked Jesus, "And who is my neighbor?" Jesus replied, "A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho and fell into the hands of robbers, who stripped him, beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. Now by chance a priest was going down that road, and when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. And so likewise a Levite, when he passed and saw the place where he had lain, passed by too on the other side. But a Samaritan, while traveling, came near him, and when he saw him, he was moved with pity. He went to him, bandaged his wounds, having poured oil and wine on them. Then he put him on his own animal and brought him to an inn and took care of him. The next day he took out 2 denarii and gave it to the innkeeper and said, "Take care of him, and when I come back, I will repay you whatever more you spend." Which of these 3 do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell in the hands of robbers? The lawyer said, "The one who showed him mercy." And Jesus said to him, "Go and do likewise." Any questions? When Mark asked me if I would fill in for him on this particular Sunday, and I said, what is the lectionary gospel reading for that day? And he said, "I think it's the Good Samaritan." And I said, "Oh boy, one of the 2 stories everybody knows, the Good Samaritan and the prodigal son." And they both have some similarities. In each case, there are 3 people who are involved in the story. I think Amy Jill Levine says that is Jewish humor that we often don't detect. You know, it's something like a minister and a priest and a rabbi go into a bar. Instead, we have a lawyer, we have Jesus, but in addition to that, we have a priest and a Levite and a Samaritan. Now, in the times in which Jesus was giving this particular message, the people heard it differently than we would hear that today. To hear the word Samaritan conjures up something of someone who was good. In fact, Luke never mentions good Samaritan, he just says Samaritan. But we conjure that as good because so many things are named a good Samaritan in our day and age. Hospitals, credit unions. I even saw a taxi cab one day that said Good Samaritan, but he didn't stop to pick me up. Went right on by. Her point being that we often see and hear the words that Jesus speaks in ways that we've already made a decision about. This being one of the 2 most well-known parables that Jesus spoke about, we've already made up our minds. We've heard this story so many times. We've overheard it. And so when that first time that you heard it this morning, when the choir read it and sang about it, when Jill so graphically showed us what someone, a bear, needing help was about, we've already conjured in our mind what it means to be a good Samaritan. Every day in the news, we hear about the courage that someone gathers to help someone in need. Firemen and policemen racing into a fire to bring people to safety. Strangers who stop their cars on the road on I-75 when a plane crashes to go toward that fire to help get those people off that plane. A young man on the beach recently, undocumented, as we later learned, risked a little bit of his life and limb to chase a shark away that had bitten the hand of a young girl. My mother would say that shows that no good deed goes unpunished. I think maybe sometimes she was right. Years ago, I was riding on a really rainy, cold November night with my dad. It was near my birthday, and I got to go to the boys' club and spend a night playing basketball instead of doing homework. That was my treat. And as my dad picked me up in that rainy night, we were going back through the center of our town when Dad spied a man standing at the bus stop in the pouring rain without an umbrella, without any kind of covering, just shivering. And he pulled over and he said, "Are you waiting for the bus?" And the man said, "I am." And my dad said, "The bus stopped running hours ago. Get in my car and I'll take you home." As we drove along, my dad asked him where he lived. My dad was a postman. He knew most of every street in our community. And the man gave him an address, but the address was really for a tavern down the street. My dad said, "That's not your home. I know what that is." He said, "Where's your home?" And the man mumbled something, and my dad immediately did what I knew he would do. He took him to a seniors housing center. He had his choice. He had the senior housing center or the police station next door to get this man shelter and safety. By the time we got home, it was a little bit late. My mother had been worried, and she said, "Where have you been?" My dad was hoping I would never say a word, but I did. And I said, we took a man home who was cold and old and alone. And my mother said, "I wonder what that's going to lead to tomorrow." You know, this parable is unlike other parables that Jesus told. Many of the parables have a trap door, something that is so different and so unique that it shocks our senses. But for us to hear today about a Samaritan doesn't really shock us, because the word Samaritan has a goodness attached to it. But in the times in which he told that story, Samaritans and Jews had lived together for centuries. Well, they tolerated one another, but they didn't like each other. They worshiped different gods. They built different temples, but they still worked and lived among one another. They just didn't trust one another, and they had a distaste for one another. And so when this story is told to a lawyer who is seeking to find out if he can test Jesus and catch him in some kind of error about the law, Jesus tells a story which catches him in what he is attempting to do. Amy Jill Levine says that she thinks that the lawyer really was asking for permission from Jesus if he only has to take care of neighbors that are like himself. Who can I hate? Jesus, give me permission. In that day and time, to hear a story that Jesus tells about a priest and a Levite and a Samaritan would be like in our day and age to hear that Larry and Moe and Hamas had come to our aid when we were laying in a ditch. Or think of the worst possible person that you would ever want to deal with in any kind of situation being the person who comes to your aid at your most vulnerable moment in life. Many of the things that happen to us in life are because of the intersections that we have with people we least expect. I dare say that people who have the courage to go and help someone else in need that they don't know must have that built into their DNA, because most of us can't do that. Many of us driving down the road and see somebody in need, well, at least we might call 911, or we hope somebody called 911. But we don't always have it in it. Maybe we're not physically capable of giving the help that somebody needs. Maybe just afraid. You know, we live in such a litigious society that helping somebody else can often get you in trouble. And that, I think, is what my mother was always referring to. Good deeds going unpunished. But I think there's a deeper thing here. There was a study done a number of years ago, I think in the University of Virginia, if I recall this correctly, where they studied with people and asked questions of those who had helped somebody else in a dramatic time of need, what it was that made them do that. And in most cases, someone else had previously done that to them. I have a friend back in southern Illinois. Bobby's no longer with us. He died about 25 years ago. Bobby was a POW of the Japanese in World War II in the Pacific. He escaped. For 2 years, he was on the run, and he was hidden in little villages, place to place to place, in places like Burma, hiding in the jungles. It was a group of Buddhists, families who were poor and struggling and who were feeling the effects of the Japanese invasions in their homes, who kept him, sheltered him, and gave him what little food they could of their meager existence. One morning, I was driving through a little town called Benton, Illinois, on my way to another small town called McLeansboro. And in order to get there a little quicker, I decided not to go through the main part of town, but to cut across into a kind of across-the-tracks section of town. And in front of me was a car that kept stopping in the middle of the road, not giving me enough room to pass by, on the right or on the left. And the person in the car kept stopping, getting out, opening up the trunk, getting something out of the trunk, taking it up to a porch and leaving it and running back and moving to another place along this long street. I finally, frustrated, I got out of the car and went over to see who it was and what was happening. I said, "What are you doing?" And I realized it was Bobby Hill. Bobby was leaving groceries on the steps of poor families that he had learned about in his years of living there after he returned from the war. I got to know Bobby a little bit better. He was a real introvert. His job was not the most important job that you would think, but it meant a lot to him and the people in the community. He took care of graves in the cemetery and mowed the lawn. He was not much to look at. In fact, he could be a frightening person when you first saw him, but he was always helpful to people who were trying to find their loved ones. Bobby told me about his experience in World War II and about being sheltered and saved. And I said, Bobby, that's a very Christian thing that you're doing. And he said, no, it's a very Buddhist thing that I'm doing. And he said, we'll talk about it someday. And we did. Bobby said that the thing that meant the most to him was that he was a stranger and they took care of him. When he died, his tombstone in the cemetery simply reads, Bobby Hill, prisoner of war in the Pacific, World War II, taken care of by a stranger. Any questions?